They told me later that helping a stranger can change your life, but no one ever warned me it could erase the life you had before. The rain hit my windshield so hard it blurred the road into streaks of light and shadow, each drop echoing louder than the last as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and told myself I just needed to get home. Just 10 more minutes, just one more turn, until I saw him. He stumbled out of the alley like something pulled from the dark, one hand pressed to his side, his shirt soaked through, not just from the storm. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had told me to. This wasn't my problem. This wasn't safe. But he looked up, and for a second, everything went quiet. His eyes locked onto mine through the rain, sharp, aware, too focused for someone barely standing. Not scared, not desperate, calculating. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. I hit the brakes before I could think it through. The tires slid a little on the wet pavement, and I just sat there, heart pounding, staring at him as he leaned against the brick wall like it was the only thing keeping him upright. I rolled the window down an inch. "You need help?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. He didn't answer right away. He studied me, like he was deciding something important. Then he took one step forward. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, controlled, like the rain didn't exist around us. Not what I expected. Not thank you. Not please. A warning. I should have listened. Instead, I unlocked the door. It was a mistake I felt the second he got into my car, bringing the cold air and something heavier with him, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore either. He didn't slump or collapse like I thought he would. He stayed upright, tense, every movement deliberate, like even injured, he was still in control. I drove without asking where to go. I just took him to my apartment because it was close and because I couldn't think of anything else to do. The silence between us filled the car, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the sound of the rain and his uneven breathing. When we got inside, I grabbed the first aid kit with shaking hands and told myself this was simple. Clean the wound. Stop the bleeding. Then he'd leave, and this would be over. But nothing about him was simple. Up close, I could see the details I missed before. The way he watched every corner of the room. The way his jaw tightened every time I moved too fast. The way he didn't ask for help but allowed it, like it was a temporary inconvenience. "You don't have to do this," he said as I knelt beside him, my hands hovering for a second before I started. "I know," I whispered, even though I didn't. His gaze didn't leave me. Not once. And something about that made my pulse race in a way I didn't understand. When I finally finished, he stood up like the injury didn't matter, like none of this mattered. He paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on the handle. "You should forget this happened," he said. I almost laughed. Like that was possible. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm, leaving nothing behind except silence and the feeling that I had just stepped into something I couldn't see yet. I didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, when the black SUVs pulled up outside my building, I realized I hadn't helped a stranger. I had helped someone the world didn't forget. I knew something was wrong before I even looked outside because the air felt different, heavier, like the world had shifted while I was not paying attention. And when I finally pulled the curtain back just an inch, my breath caught in my throat as two black SUVs sat across the street like they had always been there. Engines quiet, windows dark, not a single movement, but somehow watching everything at once. And for a moment, I told myself it was nothing, just expensive cars parked in the wrong neighborhood. But deep down, I already knew that was a lie because nothing about last night had been normal and nothing about those cars felt accidental. I stepped back from the window slowly, my heart beating too fast, trying to think, trying to convince myself to stay calm. But then there was a knock at my door, not loud, not aggressive, just controlled, precise, the kind of knock that assumed you would answer, and I froze, every instinct telling me not to move, not to breathe. But the knock came again. Exactly the same, steady, patient, like whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world. I walked toward the door before I could stop myself, each step heavier than the last, my hand hovering over the handle as I told myself I could pretend I was not home. I could stay silent. I could wait this out. But something in me knew that would not change anything. So I opened it, just enough to see him. And everything inside me went still. He looked nothing like the man I had helped last night. And somehow exactly the same. The same sharp eyes, the same controlled presence. But now there was no weakness, no sign of struggle, just a tailored black coat. perfectly dry despite the rain still falling outside, and behind him, two men stood a few steps back, silent, alert, watching me like I was something they needed to understand. "Good morning, Emily," he said, my name in his voice like it belonged. There, like he had known it for years. And that was the moment the fear really set in, because I had never told him who I was. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "How do you know my name?" I asked, and his expression did not change, not even slightly. "I make it my business to know things that matter," he replied. Simple, direct, like that should explain everything. And somehow it did. He stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that I could feel the shift, the weight of his presence filling the doorway. "You helped me last night," he continued, his gaze never leaving mine. "That creates a responsibility." The words settled between us, heavier than it should have been. I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against something I could not quite define. "I was just helping someone who needed it," I said. But even as I spoke, it sounded smaller than it felt, like it no longer mattered. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, not warmth, not kindness, just recognition. "That is exactly why this matters," he said quietly. And then he glanced past me into my apartment, taking in everything in a single second, the small space, the worn couch, the life I had built piece by piece. And when his attention returned to me, something in his expression had shifted, something more final. "There are people looking for me," he said, calm, factual. "And now they will look for you." My stomach dropped, the reality of what I had done crashing into me all at once. "I did not ask for that," I whispered, and his voice lowered, steady, certain. "No, but it happened." A pause, just long enough for me to feel it. "Which means you are no longer alone in this." I should have told him to leave, should have closed the door and locked it and pretended none of this existed. But I did not move. I could not, because deep down I understood something I did not want to admit, that whatever had started last night was not something I could walk away from. And then he said the words that changed everything. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and absolute. "From this moment on, you are under my protection." And I realized he was not asking for permission. I should have said no right then, should have told him he was wrong, that he did not get to decide what happened to my life just because I had made one reckless choice in the rain. But the words never came. They stayed stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat as I stood there with the door half open and him looking at me like this was already settled, like my answer did not matter because the outcome had already been decided. And that was the part that scared me the most, not his presence, not the men behind him, but the quiet certainty in his voice. I finally found enough breath to speak. "I do not need protection," I said, even though it sounded weak the second it left my mouth, because we both knew that was no longer true. His gaze did not harden, did not challenge me. It just stayed steady, almost patient, like he had expected that response. "You needed it the moment you opened your door last night," he replied, and there was no anger in it, no threat, just a statement that landed heavier than anything else he had said. I shook my head again, trying to take control of something, anything. "Then this is your problem, not mine," I said. But even as I spoke, I could feel the shift, the way his presence seemed to close in without him moving any closer. "It became mine when you chose to help," he said quietly. And then he stepped inside without asking. Not forceful, not aggressive, just inevitable, like the space already belonged to him. I should have stopped him, should have told him to leave, but my feet stayed planted as I watched him take in the room again. Slower this time, more deliberate, like he was memorizing it, mapping it, understanding where I lived, how I lived, every small detail that made up my world. And for the first time, I felt exposed in a way I never had before, not physically, but completely seen. "You cannot just walk in here," I said, my voice sharper now, trying to reclaim some ground. And that was when he finally looked at me differently, not softer, not colder, just more focused. "I can when your safety depends on it," he replied, and the calm in his tone made it impossible to argue, because it did not sound like a threat, it sounded like a fact. One of the men behind him stepped forward slightly, holding a small device, scanning something quickly before nodding once, subtle, efficient, and then stepping back again without a word. Everything about them moved like that, precise, controlled, like they had done this 100 times before. I crossed my arms without thinking. trying to hold on to something familiar. So what? You are just going to stay here? I asked, and for the first time, something almost like amusement flickered in his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. No, he said. You are leaving. The words hit harder than I expected. I am not going anywhere, I said immediately. But he did not argue, did not raise his voice. He just held my gaze, and the silence stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. You are, he said finally, softer now, but even more certain. Because the people looking for me do not hesitate, and they do not make mistakes. My stomach tightened, the image of the cars outside flashing in my mind again, the realization settling deeper whether I wanted it to or not. I have a job. I have a life here, I said, the words sounding smaller with every second. And you will still have one, he replied. Just somewhere safer. Safer. The word echoed in my head. And for a moment, I hated how much I wanted to believe it, how much I wanted to pretend that this was something simple, something temporary. But nothing about him felt temporary. Nothing about this felt like it would end once I stepped outside that door. And as if he could read that hesitation, he stepped closer again. Not enough to trap me, just enough that I could feel the gravity of his presence. Emily, he said, my name quieter now, more personal. You did not just help a man last night. A pause, just long enough for the weight of it to build. You stepped into something that does not let people walk away. And that was the moment I realized he was not trying to convince me. He was telling me the truth. I stood there staring at him, trying to understand how a single night could unravel everything so quickly, how my small apartment that used to feel safe now felt like it had walls made of glass, like anyone could see in, like anyone could reach me. And I hated how he made it sound inevitable, like I had already crossed a line I could not uncross. I am not leaving my home because of something I did not ask for, I said, forcing the words out with more strength than I felt. And for a second, there was silence, not tense, not angry, just heavy, like the space itself was waiting to see what would happen next. He did not argue, did not interrupt. He simply watched me. And that somehow made it harder, because there was no resistance to push against, only that calm certainty that made everything I said feel smaller. Pack a bag, he said finally, his voice low but final, and something in my chest tightened, not just fear, something deeper, frustration, anger, the realization that I was losing control of my own life one sentence at a time. No, I said, shaking my head. You do not get to decide that. And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not anger, not even irritation, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, like he was reassessing me, like he was seeing something he had not expected. You are right, he said after a moment, and the words caught me off guard enough that I hesitated. I do not get to decide everything. He continued, stepping a little closer, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. But I do decide what risks I allow to exist around me. A pause, just long enough for the meaning to settle in. And right now, you are one of them. The air felt thinner suddenly, harder to breathe, because I understood what he meant, not as a threat, but as a fact, a reality I had not considered until now. I was not just in danger because of him. I was connected to him, tied to something bigger than I could see. And whether I liked it or not, that connection made me visible. I looked toward the window without thinking, toward the street where the black SUVs still waited, silent, unmoving. And for the first time, I noticed something else, a car parked further down, older, out of place, its engine idling just enough to send a faint vibration through the air. My stomach dropped. You see it now, he said quietly, following my gaze without needing to ask. I did not respond. I could not, because the truth was settling in too fast, too heavy. They are not here for a conversation, he added, and there was no fear in his voice, only certainty, the kind that came from experience, from knowing exactly how situations like this unfolded. I turned back to him slowly, my heart pounding in a way that felt louder than the rain outside. And you think taking me with you fixes that? I asked, and this time, his answer came without hesitation. It does not fix it, he said, but it controls it, controls, not ends. Not solves, just manages. And something about that honesty made it harder to argue, because he was not promising safety. He was offering structure, protection within his world, not outside of it. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to think, trying to hold on to something normal, something familiar, but there was nothing left to hold on to, not anymore. And he seemed to sense that shift before I even spoke, because when I looked back at him, he was already reaching into his coat, pulling out a phone, pressing a button without breaking eye contact. "We are leaving in 5 minutes," he said into it, calm, controlled, like this was just another part of his day, another decision already made. The line went silent as he lowered the phone, and then his attention returned to me fully, steady, unyielding. "Emily," he said, my name softer now, almost careful. "You can walk out that door with me, or you can stay here and hope they lose interest." A pause, just long enough for the weight of the choice to settle. "But I do not believe in hoping." And that was the moment I realized that whatever I chose next was not just about leaving or staying. It was about deciding whether I was going to face this alone or step into his world and let it change me. I do not remember deciding to move. I just remember my hands reaching for a bag and my mind trying to catch up with what my body had already accepted. Like some part of me understood faster than the rest that staying was no longer an option, that whatever line I had crossed last night had already erased the version of my life where I could pretend none of this was real. I pulled clothes from my closet without thinking, stuffing them into the first bag I could find, my movements quick, uneven, every second feeling like it mattered even though I did not know why. Behind me, I could feel him watching, not impatient, not rushed, just present, like he had already calculated how this would end and was simply waiting for me to reach the same conclusion. 5 minutes, he reminded. Quietly, not as pressure, just as a fact, and I nodded even though he could not see my face, my hands shaking slightly as I zipped the bag closed. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, small pieces of my life that suddenly felt insignificant compared to everything else. And then I stopped, my eyes drifting across the room, the worn couch, the small kitchen, the window that had always let in just enough light in the morning, all the little things that had made this place mine, and for a second, I hesitated, not because I thought I could stay, but because I knew I would not come back the same. "We need to go," he said, a little closer now, his voice lower, more focused. And something in it pulled me back to the moment. I nodded again, this time turning toward him, the bag heavy in my hand, heavier than it should have been, like it carried more than just clothes, like it carried everything I was leaving behind. He reached for the door before I could, opening it with a smooth, controlled motion, and the hallway outside felt different, quieter, like the building itself was holding its breath. We walked side by side, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the presence of him, steady, unwavering. And when we stepped outside, the rain had softened to a light drizzle, the street glistening under the gray morning sky, the black SUVs still waiting exactly where they had been, engines now running, doors opening before we even reached them, like they had been expecting this exact moment. The men inside moved with the same precision I had noticed before, one stepping forward to take my bag without a word, another scanning the street quickly before nodding once to him. Everything about it felt rehearsed, controlled, like nothing was left to chance. I paused just before getting into the car, my eyes drifting again to that same older vehicle down the street, still there, still idling. And this time I did not question it. I did not try to explain it away. I just felt the weight of it, the understanding that he had been right, that this was real, that this was happening. "Emily," he said, and I turned to him, his expression unreadable but steady. "Stay close," he added, not commanding, not harsh, just certain, and I realized then that this was not about control in the way I had first thought. It was about structure, about moving within a world that followed different rules than mine. I nodded once, a small movement, but it felt like a decision, and then I got into the car, the door closing softly behind me, sealing me into a space that smelled faintly of leather and something unfamiliar, something expensive, something that did not belong to my world. He got in beside me a second later, the door shutting with the same quiet finality, and as the car began to move, smooth and steady, pulling away from the only place that had ever felt like home, I looked out the window one last time, watching the building grow smaller, the street fade into the distance, and I realized I was not just leaving a place. I was leaving a version of myself that no longer existed. The city blurred past the window in streaks of gray and silver, buildings stretching higher, cleaner, quieter as we moved further away from everything I knew. And I sat there with my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to steady my breathing, trying to understand how I had gone from a normal morning to sitting in the back of a black SUV with a man who spoke in decisions instead of questions. No one said anything for a while. The silence inside the car felt controlled, not awkward, like silence was part of how they operated, like words were only used when necessary. I glanced at him once, just for a second, and found him already looking at me, not intensely, not aggressively, just aware, like he was tracking everything about me without effort. I looked away. First, focusing back on the window, on the passing streets, the distance growing between me and my old life with every mile. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended, and he answered without hesitation, "Somewhere you can breathe." I almost laughed at that, because breathing was the one thing that felt harder with every passing second. But I did not argue, because part of me understood what he meant. Even if I did not want to admit it, the car turned off the main road and into a long, private drive lined with tall trees that blocked out the rest of the world. And the shift was immediate. The noise of the city faded, replaced by something still, something controlled, something that felt like stepping into a different reality entirely. The house came into view slowly, large but not excessive, modern but grounded, the kind of place that did not need to prove anything because its presence did that on its own. The gates behind us closed the second we passed. Through a soft mechanical sound that felt louder than it should have, like a final line being drawn, the car came to a stop, and for a moment, no one moved, like there was an unspoken pause before the next part began. Then his door opened, and everything resumed. He stepped out first, one of the men opening my door a second later, offering a hand that I hesitated to take before finally stepping out on my own. The air felt different here, cleaner, quieter, but not safer. Not really, just more controlled. I followed him toward the entrance, my bag already gone somewhere behind me, handled by people who moved like they had done this their entire lives. The doors opened before we reached them, and the inside was exactly what I expected and nothing like what I knew. Clean lines, muted colors, everything in its place, everything intentional. It did not feel like a home, not at first. It felt like a space designed to function perfectly. "This will be your room," he said, leading me down a hallway without slowing, opening a door to a space that was larger than my entire apartment, bright, quiet, untouched. And I stepped inside slowly, my mind trying to process the shift, the contrast, the fact that this was where I was now. "I am not staying here long," I said automatically, turning back to him, needing to hold on to something that felt like a choice. And he did not argue, did not challenge me. He simply nodded once, like he had expected that. "You will stay as long as necessary," he replied. And there it was again, not a command, not a demand, just a statement shaped like reality. I exhaled slowly, setting my bag down on the bed, my fingers brushing against the unfamiliar fabric. Everything here felt too new, too untouched, like I did not belong in it, like I was an interruption in a world that ran without me. "What happens now?" I asked, because that was the only question that mattered. And for the first time since I had met him, he paused, just for a second, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Now," he said, his voice lower, steadier. "You stay close, and you learn." I frowned slightly, confusion mixing with everything else. "Learn what?" I asked, and his gaze held mine, calm, certain, unyielding. How to exist in a world that does not forgive mistakes. And something about the way he said it made my chest tighten, not because it sounded like a warning, but because it sounded like a truth he had lived for a very long time. And in that moment, standing in a room that was not mine, in a life I had not chosen, I realized this was not just about protection anymore. This was about transformation. I stood in that room long after he left, listening to the quiet settle around me like something unfamiliar, something that did not quite belong to me. And for the first time since everything started, there was no immediate pressure, no urgency, just space. And somehow that made it harder, because without the chaos, without the movement, I was left alone with the reality of what had happened. I walked slowly across the room, my steps hesitant, like I was testing the ground beneath me, like it might shift if I moved too quickly. Everything here was precise, intentional, untouched by the kind of life I was used to. And I could not shake the feeling that I was an outsider in a place that did not tolerate unpredictability. I set my bag down on the bed and sat beside it, my hands resting in my lap again, the same way they had in the car, like I was trying to hold myself together from the outside. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. I could not tell. Time felt different here, slower but heavier, like every second carried more weight than it should. I finally stood up and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the grounds outside, the long drive, the gate in the distance, the subtle movement of men positioned where they needed to be, not obvious, not intrusive, but present, always present. And that was when it fully settled in. This was not just protection. This was a system, a structure that operated whether I understood it or not, a world that had rules I had not learned yet. I let the curtain fall back into place and exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to decide what I was supposed to do now. Because staying in this room, waiting, did not feel like an answer, so I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps quieter now, more cautious, like I was aware of being watched even when I could not see who was watching. I followed the corridor until I heard voices, low, controlled, coming from a room further ahead, and I slowed without meaning to. Not to listen, not exactly, but because I needed to understand where I was, what I had stepped into. I reached the doorway just as the voices stopped, like they had sensed me before I even appeared, and when I stepped into view, the room shifted instantly, attention moving toward me in a way that felt measured, not surprised, just aware. He was there, standing near a table, speaking with two other men, and the moment he saw me, everything else seemed to fade into the background. Not because they left, but because his presence made everything else feel secondary. "You should rest," he said, his voice calm. Like this was a normal conversation, like I had not just walked into something I did not understand. I shook my head slightly, stepping further into the room despite myself. "I am not tired," I replied, even though I was. Even though everything in my body felt like it had been stretched too far. He studied me for a second, not dismissing me, not pushing me away, just assessing, like he was deciding something again. And then he nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "Then you observe," he said, turning slightly back to the table, but not fully away from me, like he was allowing me to stay but setting a boundary at the same time. I moved closer slowly, my eyes drifting to the surface of the table, documents, maps, details that I could not fully understand, but could feel the weight of. Everything here had purpose. Everything mattered, and I realized that this was what he meant, not just learning to exist, but learning to see, to notice the things that people like me usually ignored. "You watch everything," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it, of course he did. "You survive by noticing what others miss," he replied without looking at me, and there was something in his tone that made me pause. Something that sounded less like instruction and more like experience, like he had learned that lesson the hard way. I folded my arms lightly, not out of defiance, but to ground myself, to remind myself that I was still me, even here, even now. "And what happens if I do not want to learn?" I asked, and this time, he did look at me fully, his gaze steady, not cold, not harsh, just certain in a way that left no room for illusion. "You already started," he said quietly, and the way he said it made something shift inside me, because he was right. I had noticed the car, the silence, the way people moved, the way the world had changed around me. I had already begun to see things differently, whether I wanted to or not. And standing there, in a place that was not mine, surrounded by a world I did not choose, I realized the hardest part was not leaving my old life behind. It was accepting that I was already becoming someone who could survive in this 1 inch. The room did not feel the same after that. Not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I had. Because something in the way I looked at everything had shifted without asking for permission, and I stayed there longer than I meant to, watching the quiet exchanges, the subtle nods, the way decisions were made without being spoken out loud. It was not chaos, not even close. It was controlled, deliberate, every movement part of something larger. And for the first time, I understood that this world did not rely on noise or force. It relied on awareness, on timing, on knowing exactly when to act and when to remain still. I stepped back eventually, the weight of it all settling in deeper than before. and without saying anything, I turned and walked out of the room, the hallway feeling longer now, quieter, like it was giving me space to think, or maybe forcing me to. I did not go back to my room right away. Instead, I kept walking until I found myself near the front of the house again, where the windows stretched high enough to show the outside world in pieces, fragments of sky, trees, movement at the edges, and I stopped there, my reflection faint against the glass, looking like someone I almost recognized but not entirely. Like I had stepped slightly out of alignment with who I used to be. I wrapped my arms around myself without thinking, not from cold, but from the need to feel grounded, to remind myself that I was still here, still real, even if everything else felt uncertain. And that was when I noticed it. Not something obvious, not something loud, just a small shift beyond the gate. A car that had not been there before, positioned differently than the others, not aligned, not part of the pattern, and my chest tightened immediately, not from fear alone, but from recognition, because I understood now. I understood what he meant about noticing, about seeing what did not belong. And before I could think about what to do with that realization, I heard his voice behind me, calm, steady. "You see it," he said, not a question, just acknowledgement. I turned slightly, not fully, my eyes still on the distant shape. "It is new," I replied quietly, and there was a pause, not long, but enough to confirm that I was not wrong. He stepped closer then, stopping just beside me, not touching, but close enough that his presence grounded the moment. "You are learning faster than most," he said, and there was something different in his tone this time. Not approval, not praise, just recognition. Like I had crossed another invisible line without realizing it. I exhaled slowly, my gaze still fixed outside. "And what happens when I notice something like that?" I asked, because knowing was one thing, but acting felt like something else entirely, and his answer came without hesitation. "You tell me," he said simply, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, because that answer mattered more than I expected. It meant I was not alone in this, not completely. It meant that even in a world that did not forgive mistakes, there were still rules, still structure, still a way to exist without being consumed by it. The car outside remained still, distant but present, a reminder that this was not over, that whatever had started was still unfolding beyond these walls. And for the first time since everything began, I did not feel frozen by it. I felt aware, alert in a way that was unfamiliar but not entirely unwelcome. I shifted my weight slightly, turning away from the window. At last, meeting his gaze fully. "Then you should know," I said, my voice steadier now, stronger than it had been before. "That is not part of your system." And something in his expression changed. Subtle but unmistakable, like a calculation had just been confirmed, like a piece of a larger picture had just fallen into place. And in that moment, standing beside him instead of behind him, I realized something I had not expected. I was no longer just being protected. I was becoming part of the way he saw the world. Everything moved faster after that. Not in a way I could see, but in a way I could feel. Like the air itself had shifted, like the house was no longer just a place to stay but something active, something responding. And he did not raise his voice, did not call out orders. He simply stepped away from the window, and that was enough. The men outside adjusted, subtle movements, positions changing without drawing attention, the kind of coordination that only happens when everyone already knows their role. I stayed where I was for a second longer, my eyes still fixed on the distant car, and I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way. It was not just that I had noticed it, it was that I had understood what it meant without needing to be told. And that scared me more than anything else, because it meant I was already changing, already thinking in ways I had never needed to before. "Stay inside," he said as he passed me, his tone calm but firm, and I nodded without hesitation this time. Not because I was told to, but because I understood why. I stepped back from the window as the distance between me and the outside world suddenly felt necessary, important, like a boundary I needed to respect. The room felt quieter again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This was a waiting quiet, a listening quiet, and I could feel my own senses adjusting to it, picking up on small details, the faint sound of footsteps in the hall, the low murmur of voices that never rose above a certain level. Everything controlled, everything measured. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt strange again, stretching and compressing in ways I could not track, and I found myself standing there, not frozen, not panicked, just aware of the space, of the silence, of the way everything seemed to exist in layers I had never noticed before. And then he returned, just as calm as before, just as composed, like whatever had shifted outside had already been accounted for. "It is handled," he said simply, and there was no need to ask what that meant, not because I understood every detail, but because I understood enough. I nodded slowly, letting out a breath I had not realized I was holding, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension easing but not disappearing, just settling into something more stable, something I could begin to process. "You were right," he added after a second, his gaze steady on mine. "It did not belong." And something about hearing that, about being acknowledged in that way, made something shift inside me again. Not fear, not relief, something quieter, something more grounded, like I was no longer just reacting, I was contributing, even in a small way. I looked back toward the window, though I did not step closer this time. "Is it always like this?" I asked, my voice softer now, less uncertain, and he considered the question for a moment before answering. "It is always changing," he said. "That is why you learn to see." I nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding it in a way I could not have just hours ago. And for the first time since everything began, I felt something unexpected settle in beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, a sense of clarity, not about what would happen next, but about where I stood now. I was no longer the person who had hesitated in the rain, who had acted without understanding. I was someone who noticed, someone who adapted, someone who was beginning to understand the weight of the world I had stepped into. And as I stood there, in a place that no longer felt entirely foreign, beside a man who no longer felt entirely unreachable, I realized the truth I had been avoiding since the beginning. I did not just help him that night, I changed the direction of my own life. And now there was no going back.